The mic, or should I use the mic? Yeah, okay. Well, maybe for the sound room, I'll use the mic. It looks like people are going to trickle in over time here a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Nicholas Zegg. I'm assistant professor of forest hydrology in the Davis College, and I wanted to welcome you to this evening's seminar titled Drinking Water, Past, Present, and Future by Professor James Salzman. I'm very excited to have him here. Jim and I spoke soon after the Elk River chemical spill about the possibility of him coming and speaking, and for various reasons it didn't work out, so very happy to have you here now. This event is co-sponsored by the WVU Environmental Research Center and the Davis College of Agriculture, Natural Resources and Design, and the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development in the WVU College of Law. Specifically, I'd like to thank Jim Anderson of the ERC and Jamie Van Nostrom of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development for helping to make this happen. It's my pleasure to introduce Jim Salzman, the Samuel F. Mordecai Professor of Law in the Duke University School of Law and the Nicholas Institute Professor of Environmental Policy at Duke University. Jim earned a BA in History from Yale College, a Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School, and an MS in Engineering Sciences from Harvard as well. Jim has a very impressive vita with visiting professor and fellowship appointments at several institutions in the US, Europe, and Australia, to include Harvard, Yale, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, the European University Institute, Macquarie University in Sydney, and the Lund University in Sweden, among some other places. In addition to his academic career, he is a principal liaison and committee member on the Trade and Environmental Policy Advisory Committee that provides counsel to the EPA administrator and U.S. trade representatives on conflict involving environmental protection and international trade law. He has worked as the European Environmental Manager for S.C. Johnson Wax, where he was charged with improving environmental performance in 14 countries across Europe. Jim is the recipient of numerous awards, to include the previously mentioned chair appointments at Duke University, as well as the Lewis and Clark College Natural Resources Law Institute Distinguished Visitor Award, the Bren Fellow at UC Santa Barbara, a Fellow of the Royal Geographic Society, and a Fulbright Senior Fellow as well. Jim is also a prolific writer. He has authored 8 books and over 79 articles and essays that cover the spectrum of social, economic, and environmental systems, with topics that include natural resources policy, environmental law, climate change, carbon markets, population growth, wetland mitigation, labor rights, globalization, ecosystem services, and drinking water, among many other topics. I first became familiar with Jim's work on ecosystem services in a paper that he co-authored with Gretchen Daly titled Ecosystem Services and Decision Making, Time to Delivery. And as a physical scientist, it was a very important and profound paper for me to start thinking about how I can translate my physical sciences, earth sciences, into policy and practice to put value on what society holds important. And that was published in the Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. In 2012, he published Drinking Water, a history that tonight's seminar is going to be based on. In this book, Jim tells a fascinating and compelling story about the history of drinking water, from the reverence of water in religious and spiritual circles, through early and modern societies, to the development of public health systems to secure safe drinking water for booming human populations over the last couple centuries, and to current and historical water conflict, water use, water rights, public distrust of tap water, the bottled water frenzy, and the future of drinking water in an uncertain world of mass resource extraction, environmental change, exploding populations, and global economy. To set the context for tonight's seminar, I want to briefly read an excerpt from Jim's book here, Drinking Water, that really puts tonight's talk and the future of our water resources locally and globally into context. Many parts of the world are getting thirsty. Access to reliable, clean drinking water is no longer a given in some places and has never been an easy option in others, where assuring water to drink remains a daily challenge. Even for those with currently adequate supplies, such as ourselves here in West Virginia, access to safe drinking water will only become more difficult as climate change increases the incidence of droughts, pollution despoils existing supplies, and population growth increases demand. These regions, encompassing most of the global population, will need to increase their supplies of safe drinking water. To call this a critical challenge to humanity's future is no exaggeration. And to paraphrase further down in the paragraph, no less a business authority than the Wall Street Journal has proclaimed water as the 21st century's equivalent of oil. So despite the number of rainy days, the seemingly infinite groundwater resources, and the ever-flowing rivers that surround us here in central Appalachia, water here and across the globe really is a scarce resource. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jim to Morgantown and to the campus of West Virginia University. And please be sure to join us for a reception immediately following his talk. Thank you, Jim, for joining us.
All right, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you all for coming out on a actually beautiful night. I don't get to West Virginia enough. I think it's one of the prettiest parts of the country, so it's a real treat to be here. I want to start off tonight by telling a story, and the story involves a city in the Andean highlands in the country of Bolivia. It's called Cochabamba, and like many cities in developing countries, they face a real challenge. And the challenge is that access to safe drinking water, as Nicholas said, is by no means a given. Almost half the population does not have access to treated water. And what I mean by that is water that's coming from an infrastructure. And as a result of that, you've got this terribly, it's really a sort of tragic irony in the sense that the very poorest people have to pay the most for their drinking water because they have to buy it from vendors. Now, people have known about this for quite a while. This is not a new problem. And in the 1980s and 1990s, the international financial institutions of the globe, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, they got together and they put forward a new sort of approach they called structural adjustment. And the basic idea behind structural adjustment was the assumption of state failure. And the idea was that we need to bring in more private capital, more private actors to provide basic services. And we'll talk a bit more about this later, but the idea essentially was we should contract out the provision of services. We saw this in the U.S. in the 1980s with Reagan. We saw it in Britain with Thatcher. In order to get access to these international funds, countries had to basically adopt the approach of structural adjustment. And so Cochabamba did that. And what they did is they put out for tender a 40-year license to manage both the wastewater and the drinking water infrastructure of the region. At the same time this was being done, the National Assembly of Bolivia passed a law that forbade the private collection of water. Basically, you had to have a license in order to get water, to collect water. The consortium that won this was called Aguas del Tunari. It was really Bechtel, huge conglomerate, with a few private, local private partners. And there's a lot of debate over what happened once Bechtel took over. Did the prices go up 10%, 20%, 30%? What's not in dispute is that there were riots very quickly, within a couple of weeks. These riots were local, they were regional, a number of people died. And actually 3 months after the commencement of the contract, Cochabamba essentially voided the contract, kicked Bechtel and Aguas del Tunari out. And this was seen as a great triumph for those who are concerned about globalization. For any of you who follow the anti-globalization debates, Cochabamba is the poster child, right? If you say Cochabamba to someone, it actually will mean something if they're anti-globalization advocates or are concerned about that. While the riots were going on and the uprising, there was a group of grassroots organizations that got together, and they published something called the Cochabamba Declaration. And you can read it up here. I won't read it for you. But there are 2 points that come out of this. The first is they say water, and in this case they mean drinking water. Water is a human right. Okay, not only is it a human right, but they say it should not be treated as a commodity. So in terms of how you get access to water, why you get access to water, you get access to water because it's a right of being a citizen. You don't get access to water because you can pay for it, right, because it's mediated by markets. And what's interesting is if you contrast the Cochabamba Declaration with something that was adopted 6 years earlier at an international governmental meeting called the Dublin Declaration, this is what the nations of the world agreed to 6 years earlier. And they said the exact opposite, right? They said that water is fundamentally a commodity. It's a mistake not to treat it as a commodity. And so what we have essentially is a real schism. in terms of how we should think of drinking water. And one of the things that got me interested in this project in the first place was how a pretty remote city in Bolivia could become essentially the 21st century or 20th, 21st century equivalent of the storming of the Bastille. Right? How is it that drinking water has become so imbued with meaning? Another reason I sort of got interested in this book was I was teaching a class in the Clean Water Act, and I tend to riff when I teach, and I was saying, isn't it amazing that we've reached a time in human history when more people can get access to safe drinking water from their tap than ever before? Isn't that amazing, right? I say to my RAP students. And as I say that, I look around the room, and over half the students have bottles of water sitting in front of them on the desk, and I think to myself, that's weird, right? I mean, if drinking water from the tap is safe, why is everyone buying bottled water? And so I decided that I was going to write what I call my airport book. Right, so the idea here basically is that if you're stuck at the airport, you go to the bookstore, you don't want to buy crap like this, right? What you want to do is you want to buy this, right? Now, I'm not going to, professors, it's unseemly for professors to resort to crass commercialism, so all I will say is that the holiday season is coming up, right? Okay, enough said. So, what I want to do is to start off by getting more into the details, but I also want to sort of generate some buzz, some interest among you. So I'm going to actually, this is just what the book is about. We can skip that. Nicholas did a nice job describing it. I'm going to start off by actually offering a door prize. Okay? And the door prize is a wonderful holiday gift. And holidays are coming. So what I'm going to ask you, so think about this. There's no Googling, right? No Googling allowed. At the end of the lecture, I'm going to ask for the correct answer to this question. And if you answer this correctly, not only will you get a free copy of this book, but within reason, I will sign anything you want in the front cover. Okay? So think about that. All right. So the question I'm asking for is, can you give me the oldest example for the sale of bottled water? And we'll come back to that later. Okay, so the question I asked myself sort of out of Cochabamba is you've got this conflict, really 21st century conflict now, of whether we should think of water essentially as something you get by right or something you get by market. Is it commodity or is it a human right? And I asked myself, how far back does this go, right? When did we start thinking about water, drinking water as a right? When did we start thinking about it as something mediated by markets? And one of the things you find if you look back in terms of archaeology, and this is really universal, is that any time you find a settled society, you're going to find sophisticated engineering for that period, for the storage and the transport, the distribution of water. And you find this everywhere when you have the excavations. So, for example, up here on the left, that's Machu Picchu, right? The high Andes of Peru, very sophisticated water distribution system. Here on the right, we have the driest place on Earth, Masada, right above the Dead Sea. You've got this major cistern that basically was carved into this mountain. This is below Istanbul, right, Constantinople. This was built 600, 700 AD, these enormous cisterns for storing water. And this is the oldest example we have. This is in Jordan. This is about 3,500 years old. And I'm sure there are older examples than that. And it's not surprising, right? You're not going to be able to have a large, dense population unless you can assure some aspect of safe drinking water. And so I'm a lawyer, and I was interested where the rules go back. And so the farthest back I could go was the Bible, right, the Torah. And you actually shouldn't be surprised, or you wouldn't be surprised to think that the Jews were concerned about drinking water. They were basically this sort of roving band of shepherds who were living in a very, very dry part of the world. And so, in fact, you do find rules. There are a lot of rules about drinking water. And the first thing you find is that drinking water is considered a right. Right? There is no sale of drinking water because it would be sacrilegious to sell something that's provided by God. But there's an interesting twist to this. And the twist is, if there's human labor involved in provision of drinking water, so in other words, if you dig a well, you actually can exclude others. Property lawyers would call this a common property resource. Right? Basically, you can keep it for your own community, but no one else can use it. But there's an exception to that, and the exception is called the right of thirst. And the idea basically is that if someone from outside your community, outside your tribe, outside your family, is dying of thirst, is desperate for water, they get priority ahead of everyone else. Right? So it's not truly exclusive. And again, this lawyers would call this, or legal philosophers would call this what's called a Rawlsian rule, right? Named after a guy called John Rawls, who basically said, what kind of rules would you want if you had a veil of ignorance, if you didn't know who you would be in society? And this is exactly the kind of rule you would want, because you don't know if you're going to be the next person who's dying of thirst and needs water. If you look to the Islamic tradition, it's almost identical, right? But actually, quick cultural question. Anyone know what this is a picture of up here on the upper right? Check your movie knowledge. Lawrence of Arabia, right? This classic Lawrence of Arabia. Omar Sharif is emerging from the shimmers of the hot desert and blows away Peter O'Toole, Lawrence of Arabia's guide, who, wrong tribe, wrong well, right? This is not the right of thirst right here, but it makes for a good movie. What's interesting about this is Sharia is the name for Islamic law, and it literally means way to water, which again is not surprising, right? This is a community where water is fundamental to their existence. And you can read up here, it's the same thing as the right of thirst, right? In the Jewish Bible, the Torah, basically you're supposed to share, it's a holy duty to share water. And if you look elsewhere around the world, you find other similar types of rules. What's particularly interesting is you can get different types of pollution. So in traditional Hindu society, the notion is not only of physical pollution of water, but metaphysical pollution of water. And so each Hindu caste has its own drinking water supply. So you don't actually drink impure water. But even there, this sort of spiritual act, there's sharing as well. And before we sort of say, oh, metaphysical pollution, what a crazy idea, it's what we did in the U.S. Up until really the change of civil rights, right? This photo is taken from the courthouse in Grantham County, North Carolina, right? This is sort of the way we did business in the States, at least in the South, for a very long period of time as well. And so really anywhere you look around the world in terms of indigenous cultures, you find a right of thirst. You find water treated basically as a right. It is not treated as a commodity. And what's interesting about this is a very, very robust rule, right? This type of rule has endured for thousands of years in many of these societies. And so the question then becomes, so when does water start to be thought of as a commodity, as something that markets determine who gets it? And the answer for that, you turn to really where you turn for all things water, which is ancient Rome. Right, the Romans really understood how to manage water. And I think it's quite remarkable that today, this aqueduct is just an example. There are a fair number of aqueducts that are standing. Not only is the engineering they used have structural integrity, right, 2,000, 2,500 years later, it's beautiful. Right? The Romans really understood how to do this. And for those of you who've traveled in Italy, the culture really reveres water. You find fountains everywhere. Right? So this is not just something the Romans were interested in. And as you know, Rome carried, at least for Rome, the water was transported primarily by aqueducts, not primarily for drinking water, primarily for what the great Roman insight for managing safe water was not bringing in drinking water; it was bringing in water to flush out the wastes. Right? The Romans understood you have to have sanitation in order to have safe drinking water, and that lesson actually was lost through most of Europe until about the 1800s, which I'll talk about a bit later. But one of the aqueducts in particular, the Marcia, and the aqueduct, mainly the Marcia, brought in very good water, and it was used mainly for drinking water. And the drinking water is provided in a basin called the Lacus, L-A-C-U-S. This is an etching of what it looked like. It was essentially a public well, the version of a public well. This is a photo of Pompeii, right? The Roman city that was buried by Vesuvius. Do you see the white marble basin right there, lower right, and then upper left? Those are Lacus, right? That's what it looked like, and that's for most Romans where you got your drinking water when you were, basically in Roman times. But here's where things start to get interesting. There was private water supply in Rome, and so particularly for the Marcia, the water was piped into private houses. And we know this is important because most senators actually had piped water. There's a guy called Frontinus. He was a Roman water engineer, and he wrote a treatise. Thanks. Oftentimes I get handed a bottle of water. People snicker at me. All right, so we'll talk about that later. And so this was piped in, and we know it was important, as I said, because most senators had it piped in. And there were no faucets. And so how were they charged? They were charged based, it was flowing water. They were charged based on the diameter of the water pipe. Bigger diameter, bigger fee. It was called a vectigal. And we also know it was valued because there was this thing Frontinus complained about, that he called puncturing. And the idea was late at night, these folks would go out, pick up the flagstones, and basically puncture the water mains with their own private pipes and pipe it illicitly into their house. And we know it was a big deal because there was a fine of 100,000 sesterces. You know, Google Exchange does not help with this, but 100,000 of most anything is going to be worth something, right? And so this was the problem. And puncturing is not just a problem in ancient Rome. This is a photo from Lagos, Nigeria. Anyone know what they're puncturing here? It's electricity, right? Do not do this at home, right? But this is what they're doing. They're basically putting their own sort of homemade wires on the mains and taking it into their house. Same idea. So how did water financing work? So essentially you had a very sophisticated cross-subsidization system where the state would pay for the basic infrastructure, the vectigal paid for the upkeep, but for most Romans who got their water from the locus, it was free. It was a human right. For those who paid, it was a marketed good. So the conception of water differed dramatically on how you got your water, right? It's sort of these two meanings in the same time. But there was a political aspect as well. So for those of you who know your Roman history, Augustus took over after Julius Caesar was killed. Augustus was the first Roman dictator, right? Prior to Augustus, it was a republic. And one of the very first things he did is quite interesting, is he dramatically increased the number of locus and made them much more ornate. So why would he do that? He did that as a political statement, right? The phrase was used, aqua nomine Caesaris. It's literally water in the name of your leader. And this is not a new move, right? So if you think about totalitarian dictators, Stalin, Castro, Il Jong-sun, I always get his name wrong, for North Korea. Anyway, you know who I'm talking about. What do, right? They build these massive public works projects that say, look at me, right? And it's the same move going on here. It basically justifies the regime. Okay, so we start to see in Rome markets and rights for water start to intermingle. So what about sort of the dominance of markets? And for that, we look to the area, we look for dominance of markets as well, which of course is New York City, right? History of New York. So we all know the story, the Dutch buy the island of Manhattan for the Native Americans for beads and for a trunk of valuables. The Dutch come in, they build a fort. And it's a Dutch East India Company. It's not really the government. They're trying to make money as a trading post. They do dig a well, but the main way they get their water is either collected from rain, or there was a shallow lake called the Calhook. It was later called the Collect when the English came over. For those of you who know New York, it's about 34th and Broadway, where it was. The local Dutch say to Peter Stuyvesant, who's a governor, we need some funds to build public wells. Stuyvesant says, forget it. We're a business. We're not a charity. The British come sailing up the Hudson. The Dutch run into their fort. They close the gate. They turn around, make sure the gate's closed, turn around again, and realize there's no well in the fort. So they open the gate, and they leave because they can't withstand the siege. The British come in. They change the name from New Amsterdam to New York, and they start building wells. But they don't build a lot. And the settlers are still relying on the Collect, which by the mid-1700s is gross. Right, you've got slaughterhouses there. There's no sanitation system. This is a quote from a newspaper at the time. They called it a very sinking common sewer. My favorite, though, is a Swedish botanist. So his name is Peter Kalm, and he's traveling around the States, and he's writing this travelogue for back home. And he's got a line that Rodney Dangerfield would have loved. He says, the water in New York City is so bad that horses from out of town refuse to drink it. Right? This is a problem. And so what happens is the rise of a private market. It's called tea water. And there are these deep wells in town where basically they pump out this good quality water. They put them in barrels, and these carts go up and down the streets selling tea water. Now that's fine if you can pay for the tea water. It's not fine if you're poor, and it's not fine if you need to fight a fire. And so the city government gets together, and they actually issue the first money issued by a city. It's called Waterworks Money. And they've got this huge plan where they're going to have aqueducts throughout the city and a pump for everything. And they actually start building it, but the timing is not good. Right? The timing is not good because they approve it in 1774, and the British occupy New York in 1776. They destroy everything. So the war ends, and you start getting public drinking water supplies infrastructure built in Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, not in New York. And New York is really growing, and so something needs to be done. And here's where the story takes a very bizarre turn. So Aaron Burr, who is pictured here, and Alexander Hamilton team up. Yes, for those of you who remember your AP US history, this is the same Aaron Burr who shot and killed Alexander Hamilton seven years later. The business did not end up going well. But what they do is Burr goes up to the State House, State Assembly in Albany, and he persuades Albany to pass a law that does three things. It gives a charter for the Manhattan Company to provide pure and wholesome water to the city of New York. It gives them the right to raise $2 million, and it gives them a monopoly. So they can basically shut down the tea water trade. Now, Aaron Burr was a scoundrel. He was a brilliant scoundrel, but he was a scoundrel. And Aaron Burr had no intention of providing drinking water. So what he does is he takes the $2 million, he spends 10% of it to pipe in water from the collect, and he lends the rest of it with interest. What was his game? His game essentially was to create a bank without the strictures of a bank charter. And a few years later, a few decades later, they basically drop all pretense, and the Manhattan Company becomes the Chase Manhattan Bank. This is a true story. Everything else I told you I made up. But this is true. And not only that, the logo for Chase Manhattan Bank is basically the cross-section of a wooden water pipe. That's it. It's sort of a iconic graphic of that. So next time you see Chase Manhattan Bank, this is actually a great thing. Another reason you should buy this book is there are many things you can drop at cocktail parties. People say, I didn't know that, right? Interesting. Okay, so what happens? What happens is that the water continues to be a problem, and there are fires, there are cholera outbreaks, and finally, in the 1830s, the state and city government step in, and they build a big reservoir at Croton. They pipe the water in. 7 years later, they go up to the Catskills in Delaware. And so what you see with the story of New York City really is the logical conclusion of privatization. And only when it clearly has not worked does the government step in. But even then, you've got the equivalent of a right of thirst, because for about 10 or 15 years after water became piped in New York, you still could get water for free through what were called Croton Street hydrants, because the water pressure was nothing like it is today. And so you could simply go and fill a bucket if you wanted. That ends up changing about 20 years later, because by then, most of the water is actually piped into private residences. Why is that? It's not for drinking water. It's for this newfangled invention called the water closet, all right, where people actually can go to the bathroom without going outside to an outhouse, and they need water to flush it. Now, I could have told you similar stories in Paris, London, Boston, Baltimore, other places, but I want to sort of leave that story for a moment and turn to the other aspect of the history of drinking water, and that's safety, right? It's not enough to say, do we have access to drinking water? Obviously, the corollary is, can we drink the water? And every society asks, is it safe drinking water? And this actually was sort of intellectually, this was the most interesting part of the whole book project for me, because to say drinking water is safe is actually a pretty complicated notion. Right? What does it mean to actually say drinking water is safe? Because if we go back in a time capsule 100 or 150 years, you wouldn't drink that water, I wouldn't drink that water, and yet to the people at the time, it was safe. Right? So why is that? And it turns out that our notions of safety are premised on our understanding of what causes disease. Right? And that's changed over time, as has our notion of what actually safe drinking water, what safe drinking water means. So for example, really up until the mid-1800s, late 1800s, the dominant theory for what caused disease was called the miasmatic theory. And the idea was these sort of these airborne miasma, right? You were breathing diseased air. And it's not a crazy idea, right? They sort of had part of it. But the idea was that drinking water could make you sick, but wouldn't kill you, wouldn't make you really sick. And this sort of comes into play with a guy called John Snow. So Snow was a self-made man. He was a Yorkshireman. He was a doctor. He actually delivered the first royal baby through anesthesia, right? Delivered one of Queen Victoria's kids, anesthetized her. He was convinced that drinking water was the cause of cholera. That cholera was basically a waterborne disease. And he was laughed at. The Lancet, which was in the 1830s and is still today one of the world's great medical journals, they had an editorial denouncing him in the 1830s, saying this is a ridiculous, a pernicious idea. They actually, it's true, 6 years ago, they published a retraction of that. So Snow had a problem, though. The problem was he couldn't figure out a way to actually prove this, even though he knew in his heart that he was right. But he got his chance. And the chance happened in 1854, where there was a pump called the Broad Street Pump in a part of London called Soho. A lot of people died of cholera very quickly and died. And there had been a change in the law about 10 years earlier where the government required that, starting from the time that law was passed, when someone died, you had to write down the details, who they were, cause of death, where they lived. Prior to that, it was quite literally like Monty Python's Bring Out Your Dead, right? If you died, you were just gone, and no one knew or really cared. So what Snow did is he got all this information, and he got a map of Soho, and he actually marked on the map where all these people lived. This is the very first time in human history you have epidemiology, right? This is the foundation of the discipline of public health. It's hard for you to see it, but there's a black circle right in the middle that says pump. Right? That was the Broad Street pump. And you've got a great story there that the pump must have been the cause of all of this, but there was a problem. And the problem was that 2 people had died of cholera at the same time. One lived 7 miles away, one lived 11 miles away. And so Snow was a careful researcher, so he went to visit the person who lived 7 miles away and was consoling him about the loss of his mother. And they started chatting, and the son said, you know, it's interesting, she used to live in Soho. And she so loved the water there that she would send her servant once a week to get water from the Broad Street pump. So Snow goes, interesting. Anything else happen recently? And he says, yes, you know, in fact, my aunt died last week of cholera too. In fact, she had come to visit my mother, and they had shared some water together. And then she went, and unfortunately she died. So Snow goes to the city authorities. They close down the pump. This is sort of the first example of sort of public health driving policy decisions. And in fact, the symbol today for the International Society of Epidemiology is a pump handle. Right? This is sort of where it all starts. So what does it mean sort of for safe drinking water in the U.S.? Well, the germ theory starts to take hold, late 1800s, early 1900s. In the U.S., you didn't have drinking fountains until the 1920s. And so the way that you got public sort of free drinking water was from these faucets. And there was a cup, a mug, that was attached by chain to the faucet. Now, if you care about the germ theory, this is a bad idea, right? So the question is, how do you change it? And what you had were these literally state boards of health. This is something that was issued by the Minnesota State Board of Health. And it basically, you know what they're saying, right? You know, if you want to die quickly, go ahead and drink this water. Or you've got these special groups. There's one group called the Cup Campaigner. They have their own newspaper. And here you've got basically, you know, death saying, come here, my sweetie, have a little sip. But drinking water, safe drinking water obviously is not just an issue in the past. It's an issue today as well. Oh, there's one thing I forgot. So here's the challenge, right? So the challenge is if you want to move away from using these chained cups to provide drinking water, how are you going to do it, right? So there's this need, this demand for safe, disposable, inexpensive cups. And what you get is the Dixie cup. This is the patent application for the Dixie cup, which comes out at the same time. And that sort of explains the origin of the Dixie cup. Not as interesting as Chase Manhattan Bank, but pretty interesting, right? If you dropped that at a party, people go, interesting, right? I would. Okay, so we've got some safe, but you know, that safe drinking water is not just an issue of the past. It's an issue today as well. A lot of people freak out when they see this stat right here. And this is a valid statistic. Any water you drink, in fact, this water right here, this came from the tap, bottled water, it's going to contain anywhere from 40 to 60 to 80 synthetic compounds, right? A lot of it will be meds. And the question is, should we be worried about that? Concentrations are very low, and we can talk about that a bit later, but it's an issue, right? There's no question that our water has a lot of synthetic compounds in it. Fracking, big issue today. We can talk about that later as well. And of course, as you all know very well, in the last year, there have been 2 major drinking water incidents, right? So the Elk River you all know about. You may have heard about Lake Erie as well. Toledo this summer, they had to basically have a boil water, no drink period for about a week as well. I actually had a great time. There was a guy called Buzzy someone or other. He told me he had the most popular talk radio show in Charleston, West Virginia. And so I went on 2 or 3 times while this was playing out, talking about drinking water. And I can tell you, the citizens of Charleston, West Virginia, they know a lot about drinking water now, right? This is a big issue for them. So it's not something that sort of is an artifact of history. I mean, providing clean drinking water, safe drinking water today remains very much challenged, and the system is extremely underfunded, which we can talk about after I finish this as well, if you'd like. What I want to turn to now, though, is what I think is, in a sense, in terms of quality of life, the real problem with drinking water. I mean, in the States, we have to be vigilant, but it doesn't affect our everyday lives. In the developing world, it really does. So these numbers obviously are rough, but they're daunting. right? Even if they're off by, by some, the fact is that huge numbers of people around the world, many of them in the developing world, do not have access to safe drinking water or to sanitation. Obviously, those two are connected. The UN knows this, right? And so one of their Millennium Development Goals has been to improve the access to safe drinking water, but it remains a major challenge. And when I talk to folks about this, what I basically say is take everything that you assume about drinking water, and then when you go to the developing world, completely reverse it, right? So, for example, I don't think about drinking water quality, right? I'm happy to drink this water, whether it's here in Morgantown or whether I go up to Bangor, Maine, or to Albuquerque, right? I'm assuming the water quality is good, and it is good. I don't care about quantity. In fact, I fill my swimming pool with drinking water, right? I fill my radiator with drinking water. In fact, I feed my grass drinking water, right? I don't give any thought to the amount of water that I mean, I do personally, but most people don't give any thought to the amount of water that they use. And finally, it's not my problem, right? There is a utility or a government or someone else who's worried about doing all this. In the developing world, none of that is true. Quality is certainly not a given. Quantity generally is limited by how much you can carry. And it's a personal responsibility. And in fact, it's not even a personal responsibility. It's women's responsibility. There's an enormous gender divergence in the developing world over responsibility for collecting drinking water. This is in a rural part of India. There happens to be a man there. That's actually unusual. There's been a lot of study done on this. And it turns out that from an economic perspective, it's a disastrous situation because you've got half the population that's spending 90 minutes, 3 hours, sometimes 5 hours a day not doing sort of economically productive work, but basically trying to get water. And if you talk to folks who work in the development world, what they will tell you is one of the single most important things you can do to improve quality of life in a developing community very quickly is to bring in safe drinking water. Okay. The problem is, as I said earlier, it's expensive, sometimes 12 to 20 times more expensive. Now, it's not as if selling drinking water is a new thing, right? This is a painting by Velázquez back in the 1700s, right? People have always sold drinking water, but that's not a productive way to do this. And so that's where, so that's where we sort of get into this debate that I talked about initially with Cochabamba, right? So everyone knows this is a huge problem. The issue is, how do you address it? And structural adjustment basically says state failure, right? The public institutions have not been able to do this. We need to bring in private enterprise. We need to bring in more capital, more expertise, and so we should privatize. And that's really what's been happening around the globe for the last 20 or 30 years. There are these companies that have been active in a lot of different places. It's a complicated story. There have been some great successes and some failures. But this has sort of been where the market has been going. And the idea, it's not a crazy idea. It's because, I mean, it's not as if the very poorest don't pay for their water. They do. And the argument is, if they do pay for their water, why don't you bring in a market situation where they're getting value for their money, right? It's not that they're going to pay for their water, right? I mean, water is a universal. So if that's the case, structural adjustment, the argument goes, makes perfect sense. But there's been pushback. And the pushback has come from folks who say, no, access to water is a human right. And this has been very active in the UN. So the ECOSOC published a General Comment 15. The General Assembly 2 years ago adopted a resolution that stated explicitly access to drinking water is a human right, right? And so you've got this sort of real conflict going where you've got these sort of major political bodies like the UN General Assembly saying it's a human right, and you've got the international financial institutions saying no, it's a marketed good, right? And so where that leaves us is this real sort of fissure, right? This chasm, where you know, depending on who you talk to, either drinking water is a good, is a right, or it's a good. It should be mediated by markets or by government. And that's sort of where we find ourselves right now. And so I want to end by sort of giving what I think are hopefully some insights into how to think about this. The first thing is this notion of rights versus markets, in a sense, is very artificial. Right? We've had drinking water as a right for a very, very long time. In fact, as far back as we can go. But we've thought of drinking water as a marketed good at least since the Romans, maybe earlier than that. And oftentimes they work together with this idea of this right of thirst. So rights versus markets, it's a facile political slogan. I don't think it's very helpful in terms of how to think about it. The second thing, and this is for folks who either are law students or are thinking about law school, is that when you think about natural resources and how you manage natural resources, there are two key things to keep in mind. The first is the notion of scarcity. Right? If a resource is not scarce, you don't need rules, right? Because no one's battling over who gets access to it. We don't have rules over breathing air. We want to make sure the air is clean, but over who gets to breathe air, we don't have rules because we can all breathe the air. Drinking water in some places where it's scarce is very different. So we need to have the rules. The question, though, is what kind of rules make sense? And to really think about that in a sophisticated way, you have to realize that natural resources have their own natures, right? And water is actually a pretty complicated resource. It's a physical resource. You got to move it. It's a cultural symbol, right? Who gets access and when do they get access? Social market we talked about, political statement. And it's got a priced aspect as well. And I think this makes a lot of sense if you think about the Romans, right? The Romans really understood how to manage water, and their system would have stayed in place. It stayed in place for 800 years. It would have been in place longer if the barbarians hadn't come over the walls. Why was that? And the reason is they were able to manage for every nature of water very effectively. They were able to move it. They had the locus, so it was a free good. They had it priced when it needed to be priced. And they realized the importance of it in terms of justifying the politics. So what happened in Cochabamba? Well, in Cochabamba, all they focused on was the price. Right? They didn't focus on any of the other aspects. And what got people out in the streets was not the rise in price. What got people out in the streets was the National Assembly saying, you're no longer allowed to collect water on your own. You need a license. And they basically took this entitlement, took this right they had, and they said it's not there anymore. Right? If you want to get water, you got to pay someone for it. They changed the whole notion of what it is to get access to water. So, a lot more to talk about on that, but I will stop with that, and I will get to the the question I asked you before we can have some Q&A before you all flee. So, the question is, what is the oldest example for the sale of bottled water? And there is no such thing as a bad. Well, there is, but we're not going to go there. Yeah. Boston? Okay. What I'm looking for is actually some kind of, not sort of the place, but what was it? What was the example? So what do you have in mind when you say Boston? Okay. Throw it out there. All right. Any other ideas? Yeah. Bottles from Rome, right? You saw the slide. Sort of, but the question is, what were those bottles? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, but the question is, why were they selling them, right? Because there's always been storage of water. The question is, what was the first example you know for the sale of bottled? Where was there? And there actually was a market for bottled water. People were going around actually buying this stuff. Yeah. Medicinal use? Not exactly. Not exactly. You're getting very close, and I'm going to stick with you because you could go big time. Okay. So when you say spiritual use, you need to work with me on this. What do you mean by spiritual use?
Like holy water.
That's it. What is your name?
Yeah.
Did I give you the answer beforehand? No. All right. So there you go. So first of all, I think we should all congratulate her. All right. So here's the story. Okay. The story is throughout history, anytime you find natural springs, there are always metaphysical explanations. I mean, what could be weirder than water coming out of a rock, right? So these cultures, you've got these druids, you've got sprites, you've got fairies. There's some kind of supernatural explanation for what's going on. The early Christian missionaries knew this. And so what they would do is when they came to new territory, they would change the creation stories. And they'd have a local saint who had done some kind of act. And that's why the water was coming out of the ground. And starting about 500, 600, 700 AD, you start getting the pilgrims. Basically these sort of Chaucer folks would go to these holy sites, and they would leave basically contributions. And the church realized this, and they started building churches, monasteries, convents at these sites, essentially to collect the money. And in fact, in the year 800, the English king made it illegal to go on mission to holy wells. Which made it all the more exciting, right? Because then it was illicit. And so here's the problem, though. So Nicholas basically is going to the Holy Well of St. James in Charleston. So he goes there and he comes back and he says, "I have here the holy water from the St. James well." And I say, "Sure you do." Right? My guess is you actually went behind your hovel to the stream and just got some water there, and you're saying it's St. James water. So how can Nicholas prove or prove as best he can, that that water really came from the well of St. James in Charleston. Any ideas? Get a receipt. Good. You can always fake it. Sort of, right? So what happened was all of these places where they were basically collecting a lot of money for the holy water, they had ceramic kilns. And they would basically produce their own bottles. So you were right on the bottle idea. And so Nicholas can't prove to me that the water itself came from the holy well, but he can prove to me that the bottle, the flask, came from the holy well. And this is the first example we have of branded packaging, right? Way before Perrier, right? This is taken from about 400 something from Athens, and so this goes way back. And again, it's a very clever market solution to a problem. So we've got about 5 or 10 minutes. I don't know if folks have any questions. I know you all want to get to the food and drink, as do I. But there must be a few things you're curious about. So if we can do 2 or 3 questions, that'd be great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question was, what about the history of disinfection, right? So the question more generally is, how do we? So historically, really until about the 1880s, 1890s, safe drinking water basically meant getting your water from a source that wasn't contaminated. But even then, it was somewhat contaminated. And so what you start getting in the 1890s is sort of what's called disinfection technologies, right? And you get 2 waves, 2 or 3 waves of these. The first is what they call sand filtration. So Glasgow, Scotland, is the first place where they have sand filtration. That's brought in to the States soon after that, and that becomes sort of a normal accepted way of treating water. But then this is an enormous breakthrough called chlorination that starts to happen around 1910 or so. And chlorination, basically, the Centers for Disease Control called chlorination one of the top 10 public health developments of the century, which surely it did, right? Because it basically kills cholera, typhoid, other germs. But the problem was that it wasn't really well accepted in the early 1910s, 20s. Orville Wright, right? He died of typhoid, right? I mean, people are still dying in the 10s and 20s of these diseases. There's a wonderful legal case. So actually, you might be amused to know that the most forward-thinking treatment works in the U.S., the first ones to adopt chlorination in the U.S. was Jersey City. Which we don't normally think more about sort of as mobster stuff, at least I do. But it turns out they sort of adopted it, and there was a lawsuit that was brought against them by the city, by Jersey City, brought against the utility. And it was a contract. They said that the contract requires that you provide pure and wholesome water. And to do that, you have to filter through sand. And the utility in court said, no, chlorination does this. And the judge, in a very forward-thinking decision, says, we accept that chlorination can provide pure and wholesome water. So that sort of opens the way for chlorination. But you got a problem, and it's a problem we face today to a certain extent as well, which is provision of drinking water has always been thought of as a local state activity. And so the feds were trying to get much more chlorination of drinking water, but they weren't willing to pass a National Drinking Water Act. So what do? What they do is they use the Interstate Commerce Commission. And what they say is any interstate carrier, bus, train, ship, if they take on water, the water must be chlorinated. And so essentially what that did is it forced communities around the country to chlorinate their water very quickly if they wanted these common carriers to stop in their towns. You don't actually have any national legislation on drinking water until 1974. Actually, in a month from now, I'm speaking at a big conference in D.C. on the 40th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And one of the interesting things of that history is that the law, as it was originally proposed, was called the Pure Drinking Water Act. And one of the reasons they changed it is that we don't get pure water, right? We get safe water, and there's a difference. So anyway, so that's I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. One more question? With this many students, there's got to be one. Oh, let me take, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Right, the Brita filters. Yeah. That was actually a study that was done by the U.S. Geologic Survey. There were 2 studies. One was the U.S. Geologic Survey, another was done by the Associated Press. And those actually were medications. that are in drinking water. So how are medications getting in our drinking water? Those actually were done in streams. They're also in our drinking water. So how are they getting in our streams? Two main ways. One is folks flush pills down the toilet. That's one cause. The much larger cause is that we generally only partially metabolize medications when we take them. And so basically when we go to the bathroom, part of the meds are just passing through us and going into the water. And so one question is, should that be cause for concern? And again, that's where you get to the question of what's safe, right? And it comes down to a certain extent to how much risk are we willing to bear, how much are we willing to pay, right? It would cost a great deal. We could get those contaminants out of drinking water, but it would cost an enormous amount of money, right? And the question is, are we willing to do that? The concentrations are very low. Scientists tell us there's no reason to be concerned, but they also tell us, we have very little experience with this type of situation. And there are a lot of parallels between that and what the folks of Charleston are facing. Right? So in Charleston, essentially, they did not have a backup intake. Right? The problem in Charleston was that where the leak occurred was only about a mile above the major intake, in fact, the only intake, main intake for the entire drinking system in Charleston. They could have had another intake point further up the river, but it cost a lot of money. And the question is, are we willing, and this funds environmental law all the time, are we willing to pay the money for that added level of security? In terms of filters, no, Brita filters are not going to address that. I actually, I don't use a filter. I certainly respect people who do. I don't think it's a crazy thing to do. I think if you buy bottled water because you think it's safer than tap water, then the thing called smart water, that's dumb water. Right? There's no reason to think that bottled water is safer for you than tap water. In fact, there are a lot of reasons to think it's less safe for you. Not that it's dangerous, but it's much less regulated than tap water. And so for the meds in drinking water, you really don't have a choice unless you're going to distill the water yourself. And we accept a lot of risk, and that's one of the risks. And I guess the point I'll end on is that I think one of the things that makes drinking water so tangible to people, so everyone has an opinion on drinking water. I think part of it is because we are so passive in this. There are a few aspects of life, and drinking water is one of them, where we fundamentally depend for our health on someone else, right? We have no way of knowing, whether this is safe or not, just as individuals. We have to rely on the utility, on the local government. And that's not a comfortable position for most people. But that's where we find ourselves. And it's one of the reasons why government oversight is so important in these cases. But it's an issue which, you asked, what about the filter? I have a lot of faith in our drinking water system, but the filter is going to catch some things. It's not going to catch most things. And that sort of, brings us to, is the drinking water safe? And for us in the 21st century, right now, it's safe enough. I sometimes wonder what people will think 50 years from now, looking back at what we're drinking, if they're going to say, boy, I can't believe they drank that. But again, we say that about 100 years ago. All right, so with that, I thank you for coming, and hope you enjoy the reception.